Hello, hello, and welcome to a conversation about change. If you know me, you know I'm never not talking about change, but this one is particularly for me fun um, because it's about the hardest part of change, which is working with resistance, working with and not against resistance. I'm going to try to make a case for you today that we are best served as change leaders and that our organizations and our teams and maybe our clients, if you are a coach, are best served if we are working with the resistance that we face to change and not against it. So we will see how we do, but in the meantime, everybody's resistance is welcome, including resistance to these ideas. So it's really important that you engage with what we're going to be doing here for this next 52 minutes through the lens of your own experience. Now, I'll be offering you what I hope are some useful tools and frameworks and ideas, but ultimately it's all going to be about what is going to serve you and the change that you are seeking to bring forward in your world and in your work. So I would love to start just to make sure that we can frame this conversation in the most useful possible way. I'd love to start with a bit of a group discussion around where are you facing resistance to change in your work right now? And I'm going to come off screen sharing and invite you to unmute if you'd like. We'd love to hear your voice for sure. If you want to share something, but you don't want it to be in your voice and you'd like it to be anonymous, you can also just drop it in the chat and I will quote you without naming you. And that way we can get the different kinds of resistance that we're seeing. So where are you seeing resistance to change in your work right now? And some other ways to think about this and to express it to us. Where is it coming from? Is it coming from your team? Do you manage a team you're trying to lead through change? Are they resisting it? Is it coming from your boss or some authority figure that you're trying to help turn a corner? Is it coming from within yourself? And what shape is it taking? So let's come off of screen share so I can see the faces of those who are on camera. Hi. And where are you seeing resistance in your system right now? What does that mean to you in this moment?
I can start.
Please, Elizabeth.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I am in Norway, and I have been the regional director in a small innovation company that was bought into a big foundation or big corporate company, and the integration has been horrible. And yeah, I think what's with change is hitting all the human feelings. You know, it's hitting fear and anger and resistance and occasionally the good feelings with happiness and joy. But it's so easy to hit the the soul so hard. You know. Mm.
Elizabeth, thank you for bringing that in because it's so real. And I think all of us can relate to those feelings of anger, fear, and all of the different forms resistance can take. We're going to talk today a bit about where those feelings are coming from and how we can work with them rather than seeing them as obstacles, which we often do. So yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. A perfect start off. Anyone can build on what Elizabeth shared or add your own perspective. What are you going through? A merger acquisition is kind of a perfect, a perfect resistance scenario. What else are you dealing with?
I coach a lot of neurodivergent clients, and I'm just starting to get a real sense that I remember when I was going through my master's program, and my attribution is going to be lacking because I cannot remember who said this. It was in a book that I read during the study that we did about change within organizations. And I remember one of the books that I read, he said, people are not afraid of change. They're afraid of loss. And so I guess I'm starting to recognize that so much of what we're afraid to change is tied to our identity, and it requires sort of like this surrender of certain parts of our identity that I think is quite fearful. And especially whenever I think that I'm noticing in some of my clients, because they have certain, diagnoses, and there comes with that a layering of identity and sometimes, honestly, some self-limiting beliefs.
Mhm.
So I guess that's kind of what I'm seeing recently.
Such an important point about loss. As we're going to talk about, every change inherently brings some kind of loss. And understanding that can help us shift the way that we show up in response to the naturally unfolding resistance that comes from it. Okay, let's keep the sharing going in the chat. I'm dropping into the chat just for fun. I run a year-round retreat online for leaders, for transformational leaders who are trying to lead change or be parts of change like you are. And earlier this year, we went deep on resistance, and I asked that group to help us list all the different kinds of resistance they're seeing in their work. And here's just a part of that laundry list, from passivity, just doing nothing, to procrastination, doing anything else but the thing that the change is requiring, to outright obstinance or rejection or backlash. So resistance can take all kinds of different forms. And it is painful, to be sure. And I think we have an opportunity here in terms of how we engage with it. So resistance to change, whatever form it takes, I'm going to make the argument today that it is normal, that it is natural, and that it is not a problem. Normal, natural, and not a problem. So let's unpack this maybe bit by bit here. First and foremost, this is a model I often use to talk about change. This is how we think change works. We think it's, change is needed. That realization begets a plan. Somebody smart writes a good plan, explains the plan around, executes the plan, and then boom, change is achieved mere moments later. The plan worked, people did as they were told, and everybody understands it and feels great about it. And yet, we've never seen change work this way in the course of human history. It's just not a straight line. It is not a straight line. I've been working in social change, organizational change, leadership development my entire career. And whether we're talking about one leader making a pivot or a team shifting or a whole organizational culture evolving, nothing ever goes according to plan. And in fact, that straight line looks a lot more like this. This is a modified change curve that I use to plot my 10 truths of radiant change. Some of you are familiar with that model. We're not going to go into all of them today, but we are going to focus in on this one right here. Truth number 4 of radiant change is that change is uncomfortable. Change is uncomfortable. It is going to be hard. And here on the change curve, we find ourselves in what's called the trough of disillusionment. I've always loved that name. It's so evocative. And for me, it sounds like something that comes out of The Princess Bride, right? It's this like wonderful kind of gruesome, evocative title. The trough of disillusionment. The trough of disillusionment is a key part of the change curve because it reminds us that this is just what happens. That the only thing more inevitable than change is resistance to change, right? This dip is just part of it. It's always part of it. So it's normal. It's natural it's natural for us, as we're going to talk about, and as Renee invoked, to feel loss in relationship to change, and for that to take us out a bit, for that to be a real struggle, right? Let's just go ahead and go there. If we choose a change in our lives of any kind, there's going to be some kind of loss involved. For example, I give up smoking, or I give up sugar, or I start working out more, right? These are changes that I'm choosing for myself. And each and every one of them carries a loss. You know, you're losing the substance that you get joy from, or some kind of fulfillment from. Maybe if you stop drinking, maybe you're losing out on something deeper like social connections, right? In some ways, there's always a loss. Even when we're choosing the change for ourselves, there's a loss. But if we haven't chosen the change for ourselves, we and our brains, and in particular, the amygdala part of our brain, the reptilian part of our brain that is always scanning for threats, will perceive that change that we haven't chosen as a threat. Our nervous system just perceives, I am in threat because of this loss that is being perceived. So that is what we're up against. That is what takes us into this trough of disillusionment. So when we're working with change, any kind of change, we are working with resistance. It's normal, it's natural. And I'm going to argue it's not necessarily a problem. Not necessarily a problem, this resistance. Which is good news, because we have to go through it to get where we're going to go. If resistance is not a problem for us, which it feels that it feels in our bones that it is an issue, that it is the problem we have to solve for. But today I'm going to argue that working with resistance instead of fighting against it actually unlocks a lot of value, a lot of information about what is really needed here. What is the shift that really needs to happen? What is the path forward really going to look like? That's what we start to uncover and discover as we learn to work with resistance and not against it. So what do we do with this resistance? How do we work effectively with it? I call it surfing the curve. Surfing the curve is a practice of meeting our system, whether that's ourselves or our team or our partner or our company or our culture, meeting our system where it is, which is the only way that we as change agents can move it forward, is to meet our system where it is today, in the resistance that it is grappling with. So before we unpack how to surf the curve, from my perspective, and I'm really eager to hear the brilliant experiences and wisdom of this group, because I know enough of you to know that you know what you're doing in this field as well. Before we unpack how to surf the curve, I just want to acknowledge that most of the time we don't want to do this. We don't want to meet the system where it is. We want the system to get up and come along with us, right? We want the people around us that are resisting to see the beauty of our vision. And we want them to get the urgent need for change that is here for us right now, right? We want them to get with the program. So we might fight against the resistance we meet, just because that's our natural human tendency, is to go into that, we meet resistance with resistance of our own. All sorts of smart rationales too for why we're right and why they're wrong. But let's just take a quick look before we get into surfing the curve. I just want to take a look at what happens when we do that. So in a given moment, whether individually, as a team, or as an organizational culture, we're either in a reactive cycle or we're in a creative cycle, okay? My work with my clients is really at the most essential level, helping them shift from reactive to creative, whether that's working with an individual leader or a leadership team or a culture, shifting from reactive to creative, which is where change becomes possible. The trick is times of change represents both an outstanding opportunity to make this shift and a real challenge to doing so, because change brings us into the reactive cycle. Let's take a look at how this works. Because change always involves a loss, as Renee said, and sometimes we perceive that loss as a threat, it tends to pull us into a scarcity mindset. A scarcity mindset fueled by the fear that there's not enough of whatever it is that we need, right? Whatever it is that we need. Not enough certainty about what's going to happen next, right? Not enough autonomy over how the change will play out in our own lives and affect us personally. Not enough access to information, not enough trust that decisions are being made fairly, right? Not enough time in the day to implement new changes that are happening in our system. Not enough. And all of these are core needs that we have as human beings, right? We all need a sense of certainty. We don't often get it, especially in times of change, but we need it. It's part of what helps us feel safe and secure. It's part of what helps our amygdala settle down so that we can be creative, so that we can look to a vision. But an absence of certainty moves us directly into scarcity a lot of the time. In the community I'd mentioned before, we unpack deeply what those needs are and how we can move to meet them for our people. But let's talk about, as long as we believe that our needs, those fundamental needs, won't be met, we tend to separate into us versus them factions. And that might be in the case of a merger or acquisition, right? Team A versus Team B. Boom, right? Us versus them. We are now warring factions instead of new collaborative colleagues. In times of organizational pivots, we might have leadership versus the staff, right? In terms of a new leader coming in and maybe bringing some new personnel into an organization and a strategic shift that's happening, we might have old versus new. In terms of the people who have tenure and seniority in the organization and those who are trying to take them in a new direction. So we're really excellent as human beings at separating and competing with one another. It happens automatically. We don't do it on purpose, but when we have that scarcity mindset, that is what we do. So our relationships become adversarial instead of collaborative, because everybody's just trying to survive, right? That's what the reactive cycle is about. Staying alive, staying safe. We might even think this cycle is what makes us successful, this competition, right? This grasping for the scarce resources that are out there. When it actually has the opposite effect, what the reactive cycle produces is resistance. It produces resistance to change. It creates greater senses of scarcity and separation and survival. And over time, it leads to decline in the system, declining engagement, declining performance, declining value, eventually. So some of us might be thinking, all the more reason to tell people to snap out of it and get with the program. But perhaps counterintuitively, that impulse only perpetuates the reactive cycle, because that's us reacting to their reactivity, right? That's us resisting their resistance. So we're fighting against it rather than working with it. Do you see how that works? I'm seeing some nods here. These are dynamics we see play out all the time in our organizations. Valerie has to jump off. Bye, Valerie. Thanks for joining. And you can check the recording out afterward. Okay. So what we want to do instead is invite people out of this reactive cycle and into the creative cycle. Let's just talk quickly about what that creative cycle is about. It doesn't run on fear the way reactive does. It runs on another four-letter word that is even more controversial in business, which I would argue is love. What does love look like in a practical context as it relates to change? Well, it means that we're starting with a mindset of trust instead of scarcity. right? Which then allows us to recognize that we're in fact in this together and that we actually need one another to be successful in bringing change forward. And once we see that, once we recognize that we are interdependent in this game, not competing, we no longer have a need to default to those survival behaviors of blaming or controlling or appeasing and pleasing one another, right? We can start coaching and challenging and creating together in the service of our shared vision. That is the creative cycle, a healthier, happier, and much more strategic place to be. And that is what Surfing the Curve invites us into. Okay, so that is what we're about to go through in terms of these steps of surfing the change curve, kind of floating along with the resistance and getting interested, curious about it, is helping us break the reactive cycle and move into creative, first and foremost, for ourselves, and then bringing others with us. Yes, Elizabeth.
Yes, I'm nodding a lot here because I agree so much with what you're saying. And I think it's one thing that is maybe not in that figure, and that is transparency. Because I believe so deeply that we stand so much better in an insecurity if we know what the change is about. If we see all our managers, leaders sitting behind glass walls with very serious faces, and then they come out and smile and then pretend as nothing had happened, and that makes the fantasy go wild and create stories that never has no root in reality.
Yeah.
So maybe it's connected to the word trust, but to dare to be transparent with your with the people in the change process, I think that's really a winner.
I think it is. I think it is connected. For what comes up for me, I think it's there in trust, in terms of trusting our people enough to be
Yes.
authentic with them, to be real with them.
Mm.
I also would put that in as a practice that we have to continually exercise, right? In the challenging vein of, okay, I'm gonna believe that you can handle this, and so I'm gonna tell you what's really going on so that you understand and can rise to meet the challenge.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Mm.
I couldn't agree more.
Mm.
Anything else come up for people around this reactive to creative cycle before we get into the nuts and bolts of, I've got 5 steps for you about surfing the curve, which I know we'll be able to sink our teeth into, but just anything on this kind of concept of these 2 cycles and how they show up in your work?
Kristen, I think the thing for me that comes up in this resistance, and it's a little bit about transparency, it's a little bit of all the things. It's about the individuals feeling seen as part of the process of change, right? And easier to do when it's a team of 5, 10, 20, 15. I don't know, I went back to 15, but it's when you get to scale in organizations, and you're talking about scale of mergers and things like that, I think the resistance starts from not feeling seen or heard in the process. And I don't know where that comes in on the resistance curve, if you will, or the resistance cycle.
Yeah.
But having gone through a big change and still continuing to see and hear that from folks, and it's simple, but it's also quite hard to execute.
It is. And what it requires, in my experience, for what it's worth, is that leadership is doing this work of shifting out of their own reactive cycle. Because as long as they are doing what Elizabeth just described in terms of, hiding, protecting, putting on a sunny face, I've worked with some leaders. I'm thinking of one situation in particular where the firm was acquired. And when I met with the leader and her leadership team, she said, I just keep telling everybody everything's going to be great. And I said, why are you telling them that? It's going to be hard. You're going to go through some stuff. You're going to have to face some big, meaty questions together. Talk about that, right? Like, let's get into that work. Let's be candid about that. But a lot of leaders feel like they have to show up, right? And put on some kind of front that is their own fear at play, right? So I think it's really important if you are a leader on this call, or if you're watching this video and you are leading some kind of organizational shift, get yourself a coach and look at the ways in which you're showing up in survival mode when really where your team needs you to be is a lot looser, a lot more open, a lot more authentic, a lot more creative in terms of moving in the direction of your vision. This is why a lot of the kind of traditional change management stuff around, you got to create a sense of urgency. You got to like build the, show them the burning platform and get it. I feel like, yes, there should be some urgency in your vision in terms of this is where we're going and why, and this is why it's so important that we do this now. But when it comes to the resistance and then bringing people through it, TJ, I think you're spot on. We have to connect with the people who are moving through this change and see them as best we can. And if the leaders at the top can recognize that and treat their next level down with that level of humanity and connection and support, then that can ripple out across the organization. And I think that's how we get to scale, is through the leadership. Because they set the conditions for the culture, right? They set the temperature of the water in a culture. And if a leader is reactive, the culture will be reactive. Full stop.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Kristen, I just want to briefly invoke something I heard from you the other night that I feel like is particularly relevant here, in that there's a difference between believing change happens to you or change happens through you. And that sense of change is happening to me, like, to Elizabeth and TJ's point, when there's a lack of transparency, it can feel like change is happening to you, and that you are put in this almost victim mentality at times. Instead, it just kind of robs you of the opportunity to empower people to realize that with personal agency, change can happen through them. And I heard that from you, and I just think it's so relevant to this particular conversation as well.
Absolutely. It behooves all of us when we're moving through change, whether we're leading it or experiencing it, to check our mindset around it for sure, and recognize when we're in that to me victim mode. To me can also include the villain blaming mode, right? Like they're the problem over there. That's also to me. As well as hero mode. I'm going to make everything okay for everybody. I'm going to save the day. I'm going to take it all on myself. All of those are different aspects of this reactive to me mindset that we need to look out for in ourselves and others. But particularly for leaders, and starting with leaders, if we hope to be transformational leaders in our systems, we have to shift to through me mode and consider that how we show up is what is going to make change possible. But everybody can be a change leader from wherever they are in a system. It doesn't mean you have to be at the top of the hierarchy, right? In fact, later on, time permitting, we can talk about what happens when the top of the hierarchy is actually the ones resisting the change. Because that happens, right? Change doesn't always come from the top. But there are ways to skillfully meet that resistance too. Okay, are we ready to talk about surfing the curve and these very simple steps? They're simple to explain. They're not always easy to do, simple and easy not being the same thing, but let's get into it. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing here. And yeah, so that's what we're doing here. We are shifting out of reactive and into creative with this simple practice of surfing the curve. We're going to break it down. Step 1 of surfing the curve. Super important. Expect it. Expect the resistance. Expect it and accept it. If you can't accept it, at least know, well, yep, Should have seen it coming. This is always going to happen. This is a natural part of change. It doesn't mean anything's wrong. What I see happen a lot when resistance comes up to meet a change that's happening in a system is the change leaders, the change agents immediately start questioning the change itself. Is this possible? Can we do this? They start questioning their plan, their strategy, right? Like, oh, if people are pushing back on it, it must mean that we aren't doing it right. Or they start questioning themselves. And they start really personalizing the resistance and making it about people don't like me. They don't believe in me. They don't think that I can do this. And I would argue that if we can learn to expect resistance as a natural part of change, we can let all that baggage go. And we can actually get curious about what is this resistance really pointing to, right? And there is probably a lot to learn about how we could shift our strategy or our approach. But it doesn't mean internalizing it, right? This is the path forward, is through resistance. It always is. It always is. So let's expect it. Okay. Expecting resistance. Simple enough. Step 2 is going to be easier or harder depending on the change that you're working with. But it's to honor the loss. So we talked earlier about how any change has inherent within it a loss. We can get better at making space to acknowledge that things are being lost, right? Part of that transparency that I think Elizabeth was talking about earlier, right? How do we acknowledge that this isn't necessarily going to be easy, that there are things that we're leaving behind? And how do we make space to honor and maybe celebrate those things, lay them to rest, if you will, or let them go in a conscious way that acknowledges what's important about them to people, right? So processing what is being lost here. So just oh yeah, please, go ahead.
We actually had a funeral and a baptism. We had a funeral of the old company, and in the same process, we had a baptism of the name of the new our department in the new company. That was, I think, it was a lot of healing in that it's people could, because it's real grief, because we had a really powerful culture, powerful. And but still we need to move on. We cannot stay in sorrow, and because that's not it's not worth it doesn't bring us on. No.
I love that you had a funeral and a baptism, bringing these ceremonies, these rituals in to just really make explicitly to make the space for processing that loss. If you don't mind, I would love to take that and share that as I'm talking with teams about how to honor the loss, because TJ saying in the chat, talk about moving to the creative cycle, right? Talk about doing this with intention and really creating that space and honoring what people are feeling. Incredible, because you're absolutely right. It's grief. It's grief. The emotions are real. And what a way to honor that. Incredible. Thank you. So just take a moment and reflect on what's in the change that you're navigating now. What's being lost? Maybe by you, maybe by somebody else. And this loss might be real in the sense of, really losing a culture that had been self-contained and self-sustaining, and that shifting into something else. There could also just be perceived losses, a loss of status. If you're moving from a smaller company to a larger company, that could be real or perceived. So we want to honor perceived losses as well when we're working with people, when we're helping them, as TJ said earlier, feel seen. So we don't necessarily want to say, but you're not really losing that. If people are feeling it, it's worth making some space for. Any other losses that are coming up for people that you can think of. It's helpful to name them. It's helpful to kind of get a little bit specific about like, oh yeah, I can see that this is something people feel that they're losing. What comes to mind?
I mean, as soon as you said that, I wrote down identity, right? It's like, I guess I'm clearly on like a being seen kick this morning, but there's a loss of identity for the team, for the leaders of the team, for the individuals going through the change, and that can be really hard.
Yeah, a loss of identity. Who am I now? Who am I now in relationship to this change in the system that's going forward? I think that point about identity is really important because it does go that deep. I think a lot of leaders gloss over that that's actually what's undercurrent, and that is what pulls us into the fear of the reactive cycle. I read something recently about how the loss is not just a loss of what was, it's also a loss of the projected future that you were anticipating. You know what I mean? And I think how we see ourselves in that is it's right there. It's why this hurts the way that it does. So easy to forget when we are, looking at timelines and spreadsheets and just thinking that, this should be mechanistically linear in terms of how we move through, but there is always that loss there.
I think a part that we have also, well, I don't know if it's a loss, but it's the feeling that we are the only ones that need to change. The big company, they just move on as they always have, and they are not willing to listen to anything that we have been doing well. So that's also a lot, it's kind of, I don't know, identity, respect, maybe being listened to, as TJ said. Yeah.
I find really useful as we are thinking about these losses and these needs, which we're going to talk about in the next couple steps. I really like working with the SCARF model. If anybody's familiar with the SCARF model of threat and reward response, it comes from Dr. David Rock of the Neuro Leadership Institute. That's where I trained as a coach. And I find SCARF really useful here. It stands for, these are our kind of 5 needs that we have, fundamental needs we have to feel safe. One is status. And status, I think, is a word that we have some negative connotation around. But for me, it gets back to what TJ was just saying about that notion of identity. Who am I now in relationship to this new paradigm, to this new hierarchy, right? Where do I fit? And am I important in this new arrangement? Is one way that we could think about status. Certainty is the C. We've talked about that and just how scarce certainty can feel in moments of change. Autonomy. How much control do we have over our own destiny, our own ways of working, our own ways of integrating this change? So Elizabeth, I'm hearing what you're saying there, but also in the relatedness, that's the R. We have a need for relatedness. We have a need to be in relationship with. And if that parent company is not connecting with us and seeking to understand us and what makes us special, then that relatedness is also at risk. And I think I'm also hearing the F, which is fairness. Are our decisions being made in ways that are fair and equitable and just? And when it just feels like the machine is rolling on and maybe rolling over us, then fairness is absolutely at issue. And there are flavors of all of these different needs that can get more and more nuanced and granular, but I do find in relationship to change that these are the big 5 that we can at least start to look into. So let's move on because we're actually going into the territory of this. So once we've honored the losses, and as Elizabeth mentioned, there's all of this emotion that's coming forward: grief, anger, sadness, fear, right? So many different emotions that are happening. Each and every one of these feelings are pointing to the needs people have. So you don't necessarily have to know automatically what the need is behind the loss. Listen to the emotions that are there. Those emotions that we so quickly want to gloss over or brush aside and say, oh, they'll get used to it, they'll get on board, or that we want to try to fix or solve for, right? Can we sit with them for a minute and really listen deeply enough to the needs that are underlying these emotions? So anxiety points to a need for safety, security, certainty, right? What's the future going to look like? People are feeling anxious, then you can actually move to meet that need. Anger indicates some kind of boundary has been crossed, right? Trust has been broken in some way. So here's where we can start to listen to the emotions and let those point us to the needs. And again, SCARF is a great model for understanding what the amygdala needs in order to feel safe, and how we can move to meet those needs. And that's the next step of surfing the curve. So we have expected resistance, we've expected resistance to arise. We've honored the losses. We're leveraging that emotional data to help us understand what is really needed here. What is really needed? And we can address those needs as best we can, right? It doesn't mean that in a conversation with a team member, you're going to be able to wave a magic wand and make all of their fears go away. But see if you can really understand, okay, do you need more certainty? Let's make sure that we have a very clear job description that is put forward for you in terms of what your expectations are in this role. And we're going to revisit it because we know that everything's changing. We're going to revisit this on a quarterly basis. And you have my promise that over the next year, we're going to meet 4 times to just make sure that we're calibrating accordingly. Right? Just one little example of how you can recognize that somebody's anxiety, that feeling, is pointing to a need for certainty. And then how do I create a little bit of certainty for that person? It can also just be as simple as saying, you know what, anytime you're feeling this, you can call me. And we'll figure it out together. That hits on certainty, that hits on relatedness, that hits on status. You're important enough to me that I will show up for you when you need me to. And just that can help us come back into relationship with one another. Move from reactive into creative. And then the last step here is the one that most leaders want to jump right to. And we should not forget, because it's super important. Refocus on the vision. We don't want to jump right to this because that is basically like fighting the resistance, right? Just like kind of skipping over it, skipping over all of that emotion and all of that need. So we don't want to go right here, but it's really important that we do end up here, because otherwise we risk kind of getting caught in a reactive cycle of focusing on what we don't have, right? Focusing on only need and not focusing on the purpose of our vision and what this change is really about to begin with. So always, as we're surfing the curve, coming back up to focus on where we're going and why and what that's about. And using that too, as we talked about earlier, challenge, coach, create together, right? That's the upswing of creative energy that we want to get back to. So I see some leaders trying to skip over the rest to get back to this and say, okay, but this is where we're going. It doesn't serve them well. I also see some leaders getting so caught up in the trough, right? And so overwhelmed by what everybody needs and never really resurfacing to get back to the vision that they kind of drown, emotionally speaking. So we want to be able to meet the needs that we can based on the emotions that are coming forward due to the losses that are really being experienced, and then bring it back to the vision and say, okay, now that we're meeting the needs that you have to operate today, let's talk about the future. Let's talk about where we're going. Let's talk about where your role fits into this bigger picture of the journey that we're on together. Refocus on the vision. That is where the energy is. That is what you're creating toward. So here are those 5 steps again. And moving through each of them before we get to refocusing on the vision really helps us stay connected, helps us stay supported and strategic as we are working with resistance. And this is really how we find out what people need, what they crave, right? This is how we find out where to focus our energy on meeting those needs that we can meet, right? That's the best possible use of our energy when we're in this trough of disillusionment. And this is how we really find out what needs to change. So for example, sometimes we're moving through a change that we think is a simple, technology adoption, right? We're introducing a new system. Okay, it should be easy enough for people to, start to do things in this new way. But if we actually show up and engage with resistance to change in this way, we recognize, oh, the result is about a technology shift. But what it's about on a human level is it's about growth mindset. People need to be reminded that it's okay to not know. Okay, how do we support them in that? How do we meet that fundamental need? Maybe it's about team dynamics. The IT team is on one side and everybody else is on the other side. And how do we build those bridges? Maybe it's about accountability. Maybe there hasn't been accountability in the culture and you're asking people to show up and do something new. They kind of get away with not doing it all the time, right? And so what needs to happen from a structural perspective to support this shift? You're going to find out a lot by surfing the curve. A lot more information, a lot more data is happening in this process than when we are simply trying to get from point A to point B. We miss all that data and we really don't know what we're working with in our system. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm very interested to know what is coming forward for you as you think about these steps. Where have you practiced? And like kind of going back to Elizabeth's beautiful example of the funeral and the baptism, where have you seen this work in terms of helping people move through change? Where are you feeling inspired to maybe do a bit more surfing? And just generally speaking, what's coming forward in your experience and your wisdom right now? I'm gonna stop sharing. We can see each other. Questions, reflections, observations.
I'll start it off. I think what's coming forward for me most right now is to use this trough of disillusionment as like the ultimate long wave, right? So how do you use this earlier in the process, or how do you make this like we're in a constant state of change, right? There's individual events like mergers and acquisitions and or layoffs or fast growth or whatever that is. It's coming up that it's like we need to be in this constant state of surfing this wave. And if you can be in that constant state of surfing this wave, you're obviously more adaptable to change. Because I feel like there can be individual changes or there can be changes from all over the place. And so it's I think helping me understand that being a more fluid leader in surfing the constant change can be extremely helpful.
Yeah, what's coming up for me as I hear you say that, TJ, is a sense of flow.
Yeah.
A sense of flow and just knowing that, change is not a sprint. It's not even a marathon. It is the ocean, right? And if we're leading change, then we are the ocean and we're coming up against the rocks ourselves, right? So it is a matter of flow and being in flow, just purely as a way to be able to sustain our own efforts and our energy, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you. Any other reflections, experiences, questions?
I can add something. I think what I've noticed in my experience of the leading change is that might seem obvious, but people are do acknowledge that change is unavoidable. But it's obviously a lot easier when the change comes from you. or your department. And it's funny how the biggest change advocates, sometimes when the change is being imposed, quote unquote, are suddenly, I mean, we all have, what I mean to say is I think we all have the same reaction to change when we're not driving the change. So I don't think that some people are better or worse. I mean, yes, to some extent. So I think what it requires is a lot of empathy, because when you're driving the change, you're so convinced about your vision, right? So it makes sense to you. So I think that's the most difficult part, is sort of really to put yourself in the other person's shoe who's receiving the change and perhaps not on the decision-making side of things.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think empathy, and I would add curiosity. I think that's what surfing the curve is about. I think it's about getting curious as to what's going on here and then being able to meet whatever shows up with a sense of, acknowledgement, understanding, and almost a sense of like, oh, of course this is going to feel that way for you. That makes sense, and let's work with that, and let's figure out how to get you what you need, because it can both be, I think, very human and very relational and very loving, and it can also be very pragmatic. That empathy.
Okay. I'm thinking that it makes a whole lot of sense, all the things you say here, the steps and empathy and curiosity, and that's how we've dealt with that and change all along. But when our buyers, they don't have those words in their vocabulary or understanding or culture at all, they just hammer. They use hammer for everything, So I know it now sounds maybe like I am a victim and a change happened to me, but it's I really felt that we tried, but was met with the hammer all along. And also another thing that one thing is to address the needs and all of that human side of the change process. But what I experienced maybe was the biggest challenge to make this work is that this is so strong G-forces in these big organizations. And those G-forces are the systems and the KPIs and how things work and the ways of working and all of that, and bureaucracy and that's you cannot fight that at all. You just have to, that curve you just have to serve. But that's kind of living beside the human factor, I think.
Yeah. And I want to just validate that this change has happened to you. I don't think that's a victim mindset. I think that's just a fact. This is a change that happens. Sometimes change happens to us. Sometimes we get acquired. Sometimes we get sick. That like change does happen to us. And sometimes we don't have the power to impact what happens the way that we would like. Sometimes that power is part of what has been lost. And what I work with my leaders who are my clients and also in the Radiant Leader community that I host is, okay, so here we are now. And how do we show up amid this? How do we decide how we come into work today and own what we can own and lead what we can lead and accept what is, so that we can continue to change what we can, starting from where we are. So not to diminish the loss and certainly not to judge anybody who is having a legitimate to me, because that's real. Doesn't mean you're in victim mode. And we can also make a practice out of coming back to, okay, what does through me look like now? What does through me look like now? And I suppose since we're over time, I'll use that as my my close. This is the year-round retreat that I host for leaders. Sandra is a member, she's here. We're online together, so it's always open. But this is what we practice in Radiant Leader. We practice through me. We practice transformational leadership. We practice just showing up for one another, because particularly when you're going through the kinds of G forces that Elizabeth just invoked, it can feel really lonely to be a leader in systems that are massive and that are transforming at the speed of light. And what we are trying to create here at Radiant Leader is a space for leaders to come and have connections with other leaders who are like them, and also the tools, the resources, the support, and the personal practices to be able to not only get things done in your work, but to do the big things. So if you are interested in that, you can check us out at radiantleader.co, tell your friends, et cetera, et cetera. But in the meantime, I've just really appreciated the group for being here today and all of the wisdom that you've brought. I've learned from you. And I think this has been a really rich conversation that will benefit not only the teams that you work with and leaders you work with, but also the people who get to watch this later. So thank you for agreeing to share it and share your insights more broadly too. I'll stick around in case there are any additional questions or observations. Otherwise, thank you, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, folks.